In this step, we will investigate much more about Spring Boot Actuator. How do I use Spring Boot Actuator? Very simple. Just like everything else with Spring Boot, using an actuator is also very simple. All that I need to do is go to pond.xml, and you have guessed it right. So I just need to add a starter for actuator. So I'm copying the starter for web and changing the starter name to actuator. That's it. It's as simple as that. So I've added in the starter for actuator. So what does the actuator bring in? Actuator actually brings in a lot of monitoring around your application. So in Actuator, you'd be able to read a lot of metadata about the application. Let's say you want to see what are the beans that are configured. You want to see how auto configuration has worked. You want to see how many times a specific service is called. You want to see how many times a specific service has failed. All that kind of stuff you can check in your actuator, and all that I need to do to enable that is add in something called an actuator in. Spring Boot Starter Actuator actually exposes a lot of REST services, and these REST services are compliant with a standard called HAL standard, and we would use a HAL browser so that we can browse through the data which is provided by these services. Dependency for HAL browser, it's Spring Data REST HAL browser. So it's Spring Data REST HAL browser. So you can save the project. The group ID should actually be data. It's all Spring Framework data, Spring Data REST HAL browser. So once we add the dependency for that, the HAL browser would be configured among our dependencies. Now you can see all the dependencies in the Maven dependencies: Spring Boot Starter Actuator, Spring Boot Actuator, Spring Data REST HAL browser. That's cool.
One of the important things to remember is that the actuator URLs have been changing quite a lot across Spring Boot releases. In Spring Boot 1.x, the URL was localhost 8080/actuator, and later in the earlier versions of Spring 2.0.0, like the milestone releases, it was called localhost 8080/application. Now again we are back to localhost 8080/actuator. So this is the URL to launch up the actuator. I mean, this is after 2.0.0 release. The URL is localhost 8080/actuator. If it does not work, then probably you can give localhost 8080/application a try. Once you type in localhost 8080/actuator, this is what you'd be seeing if you are using anything greater than 2.0.0 release. You'd see three URLs coming in, right? So these are the health and the info. So if I click health, you'd see the health of the application. It's up and running. That's cool, right? And the other one is the info. There is not a lot of info here right now. There is a lot of stuff that Actuator provides. To enable that, you need to configure a property. How do I do that? The way you can do that is go to your application.properties and type in management.endpoint.web.exposure.include is equal to star. What we are doing in here is we are enabling the web exposure. So the exposure over HTTP of all the management endpoints. One of the important things to remember is when you enable a lot of tracking, lot of auditing, what would happen is there would be a performance impact as well. One of the recommendations is to identify which of the things that you would want and only enable those. But for now, we are taking a shortcut. We are enabling everything. Management endpoints web exposure.include is equal to star. One of the things you would have already noticed is the fact that if I type in control space or command space, you'd see a drop down coming in. This is because of something called a Spring Tools plugin. So there's an Eclipse plugin called Spring Tools. So you can see that I can see what are the valid properties. It also validates the values of these properties and things like that. We configured management.endpoints.web.exposure.include is equal to star. Save it and restart your application. So make sure that you stop and start your application. If I'm going to refresh the actuator, you'd see that now there are many more URLs which are present in here. So you'd see a lot of URLs which are coming up in here. The other thing we can type in is localhost 8080. We have already added in the HAL browser. Let's zoom out a little bit. So we added in the HAL browser. So if you type in localhost 8080, you'd go to the HAL browser, and we can use HAL browser to browse through the actuator. So I can type in /actuator in here. So all that I need to do is type in /actuator. That's the URL for the actuator in here. And I can start looking through all the things related to actuator directly from here. Let's look at a few of these things that the actuator is exposing. The audit events is related to security. Audit events would show which users were properly validated, how many people failed the authentication, and all that kind of stuff. Beans is another interesting thing. I'm clicking beans. This would show all the Spring beans that are configured, right? Spring is a dependency management framework, and it manages all the beans. It creates all the components for you, and you can look at all the beans that Spring has created for you. You can also check the health of the application. It's up. Conditions is another interesting thing. As we have discussed until now, Spring Boot is all about auto configuration. There is a lot of stuff that Spring Boot auto configures. Conditions service exposes the positive matches, which are all the conditions that matched, as well as if you search for negative matches, the conditions which did not match. So it would show a list of beans which are configured, which are not configured, and all that kind of stuff. You can also get the details of configuration properties, the environment, loggers which are configured. You can also get heap dump, thread dump, and also you can get a few metrics as well. So if you go to the metrics, I can see a list of metrics which are valid. So let's say I would want to find out how much memory is used. So I can say, I can copy this jvm memories dot used and add it in here. So /jvm dot memory dot used and say go. You would see the value of the amount of memory that is being used. The same thing can be done with other metrics as well. So if I go back to the actuator metrics, you can see that there are a wide variety of metrics that are being exposed in here, CPU usage and all other kind of stuff. If I go back again to the actuator, I can also see list of scheduled tasks. There is an interesting thing called HTTP trace, which shows all the requests that were executed. So it shows, okay, this is the request which is coming in. Somebody tried to access the actuator. This is the response which went back. The time taken is so and so. So you can see all the details of the previous requests that were executed. The important thing is to remember that this would have a performance impact, right? You cannot enable it in production. This is useful to trace a few requests, but obviously you would not want to enable HTTP trace in production for all the requests. The last one which is present in here is mappings. Mappings shows all the different things that are mapped to URIs, right? So whenever we are creating a web application or a web service, we are mapping a lot of URLs. Whenever we are adding the dependency on actuator, we add a few URLs as well. So you can see all the mappings in here. The idea behind this video was to quickly give you an overview of what are all the things you can do with actuator. If some of the information you see in here is complex and you are finding it difficult to understand, no problem at all. The most important thing to understand is in future, if you need any such information, there is one place you can go to. That's actuator. Until next step, bye bye.